Okay, let's make a start. I'm Dr. Sanderson. Welcome to Poly U. Who was here last year? Any of you here last year? All of you new to Poly U. Well, welcome to Poly U. Everyone calls me Lexi because my name is such a mouthful. Okay, so whenever you address me, you can call me Lexi. That's fine. I've been at Poly U now for my 6th year. So I've had the pleasure of teaching this class for a few years now. My background is in exceptional children, and I've worked with neurodevelopmental disorders for the past 20 or so years. I won't tell you exactly how long, because it'll give away how old I am. Now, I am British. I have a very British accent. If you don't understand or you want me to slow down, tell me, okay? Because I get very excited. And I do speak quite fast. Okay, so please, I know from all of you maybe English is not your first language. Today we are going to do some interesting language. I'm going to look at the brain. We're going to look at some different brain regions as well, of which I have drawn you a beautiful diagram. You can tell I don't do art, okay? But I've also done a video as well to help with that. Now, how many of you are DLN students? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay, out of you guys, how many of you are doing Gifted and Talented on Friday? Just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The Gifted and Talented on Friday, nurturing the Gifted and Talented. Yeah? Okay, you'll have me twice a week. And for that, I apologise profusely now. Okay, this course has changed a little bit since I devised it because I'm not allowed as many outside speakers as I would normally have. So I've had to juggle a few things around. Now, whilst I set up Blackboard, I'm going to show you a little video. Now, let's hope technology is on my side and it works. Okay, for the assessment of this course, there are 5 different aspects. The individual essay, your group project, your MCQ, your multiple choice, your participation, and your peer review of presentations. Now these I will run through quite quickly, and you'll understand what I mean by peer review and participation. So your individual paper, 2,500 words, has to be in English because my reading of Mandarin and Cantonese is non-existent. It is your choice. This is your master's. You can choose what you want to do. If you're interested in education, you do it on education. If you're interested in parenting, you do it on parenting. Okay, I don't mind which you choose. But you have to do it on education or parenting and on one of the topics we've covered in the class. So that might be autism, it might be ADHD, it might be dyslexia. It's up to you. Now what you can do is do the same population for both your presentation and your individual essay. Just makes life a little bit easier for you, a little less work, okay? And you can really go in depth on what it is you want to learn. Now I will mark on the rubric, so make sure you have read the rubric, and exactly I will mark it as it says on the rubric, okay? That is available on Blackboard for you. We will go over that again when we look at the individual consultations. By week 4, I'll expect you to be in groups of 4 to 5 students. You have a 25-minute presentation with a 5-minute discussion at the end. Usually I get you to ask a question to the class, and this can be, any of you use Kahoot? Yeah, a few of you. If you've used Kahoot or you've used any other Europlies or EdTools or something fun, okay, it's a learning experience, yeah? We will talk about that more as the course goes on, so don't worry. And you can choose whatever topic you are interested in as a group. I will give you ideas and pointers
So don't worry about that. For the group presentation, you're defining your topic, your population. It's all based on empirical work, so I want you to read as many journal articles, and those need to be recent and relevant. Okay? It can be about Hong Kong. It can be globally. Up to you. And it will depend on what topic you are doing, depending on how much research you can find for that topic. So that's up to you. Again, follow the rubric. Yeah, it's there for you. Follow it. I've said about the class questions, and then the PowerPoint just needs to be submitted to me by the week. Now, I am flexible whether you want to do face-to-face presentations. Sometimes you want to do video recorded presentations and upload it to me. We will talk about that at a later date. We are very modern, and we will take whatever learning, interaction you want to do, okay? So you can do a face-to-face presentation, or you can do a video, and you can upload that for me as well. This is a brilliant website, sciencedaily.com. If you've got a QR code reader, you can have a look at it now. It does all the quirky, wonderful, new research that is coming out and has a specific place for psychology. And there's lots of interesting journals there for ADHD and autism for you to get an idea of what you might actually want to do for your projects and your individual essays. Okay, your open book is going to be in the computer room. It's going to be online. There are 40 questions and I think 47 points. Okay, but I will go through that again with you. Now, participation. I will record who is here, and we use a student response system called EdTool here at PolyU, and it'll be the last thing I do. So if you leave early, can you let me know, or I'll try and do it in the break. This first 2-week lecture on add drop period doesn't count. The rest will count to participation. Okay, and then we'll do peer review of presentations, what you have done in a group, because sometimes you don't get on at all, sometimes you get on very well, and what you think of other people's presentations. Right, so today we're going to talk about neurodevelopmental disorders. We're going to talk about terminology, labelling. We're going to go over some of the disorders that we're going to cover in this course. We're going to look at prevention, early intervention. What does Hong Kong do specifically? We're going to look at inclusion, special schools. Those of you who are shadow teachers or TAs or TLAs, are you in a special school or are you in a mainstream school? We'll talk about that. Okay, what do you think? And then we'll go on to look at classification of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases. So if we look at this, now you can't see this particularly well. Some of you have got it open in front of you, you'll be able to see the numbers. There is always and has been and will continue to be an increase in individuals who have specific learning disabilities. Intellectual disabilities, autism, ADHD, physical, visual and hearing and speech and language. It's not just because of the way we changed the classification system. There is a lot going on, and we'll talk a lot about genetics as well as some of the causes of some of these disorders. There has been quite a big jump in children with neurodevelopmental disabilities. So we're talking about a diagnostic and statistical manual that came out and was revised in 2013. I think it needs to be revised again, and it will probably be revised in the next few years. There's been a lot of changes in research and our understanding over the past 6 years. Within the DSM-5, Within neurodevelopmental disabilities, we're talking about intellectual disabilities, communication disorders, autism, specific learning disorders, motor disorders, and ADHD. Now, the only one I'm not going to include in this course is motor disorders. Okay, everything else we are doing a lecture on. I have given you a link to a PowerPoint on motor disorders if that is something you are interested in, but you won't get a lecture on that. All of these come under the umbrella neurodevelopmental disorders. They are impairments of the growth and the development of our brain and our central nervous system. Yeah, so our spinal cord and our central nervous system. Each individual who has a developmental disability, it will impact them personally, socially, academically, and in their daily living skills. These children are not what we call neurotypical. They will go on to have a lot of different issues depending on the symptoms that they have. The onset of all neurodevelopmental disabilities is before the age of 18. These are because they are a developmental issue within the brain. And I'm going to go on and look at and show you some brain regions today to show you what I'm talking about. They're all brain-based disorders. Now, some of these do coexist. So you can't necessarily just have one. You can actually be diagnosed with more than one. So you can have ADHD and a specific learning disorder. And of course there's comorbidities as well. A lot of children, 50% of children who have ADHD also have conduct disorder. So there is an awful lot going on up there in the brain. There is no cure for any of these disorders. There is no magic pill. We can help them with medication, and we can do a lot of treatments and therapies, particularly if we get there early. An early intervention is before the age of 2. We're talking about 1.5 years of age. And particularly with kids who have autism, early intervention is amazing. Yeah? So the earlier we can get onto these with treatments and therapies and medication and mindfulness as well, we can really help them. Now, I'm not going to show you this video. You can look at it in your own time. We're not going to cure these children. There's nothing we can do. There's no magic pill. There's no treatment that is going to cure them. But we can understand them, and we can help them, their educators and their parents, and also their siblings, because siblings always get left behind. You know, there's a massive impact on siblings. Okay, so we're not necessarily trying to cure them, we are trying to understand them. Now, what is very important when you're talking to parents and you're talking to school teachers and you're talking to clinicians is terminology. Okay? A mouse and a rat. Yeah, you've got to know your terms. If we are talking about a child who has a neurodevelopmental disability, they have a brain-based disorder, and we call that a neurodevelopmental disability. Children who do not have that are typically developing, or neurotypical. Okay? We don't use the term mental retardation, and I will tell you why in a minute. They have a neurodevelopmental disability, or they are neurotypical or typically developing, and that is what we call it at the moment. Very importantly, Barack Obama back in 2010, and it is very important bill, and it's known as Rosa's Law, took the phrase mental retardation mentally retarded, and took it out of all the records. Okay? It is a phrase that we just don't use anymore. We use intellectual disabilities now. Okay? So anybody who you would have said had mental retardation, we now say intellectual disabilities. And even within the DSM-5, we now use that term for anybody who's got an intellectual disability. And I'll come back onto what intellectual disability actually means in a minute. So within the DSM-5, we are now calling academic differences, academic skills in reading, in writing, and in maths. We umbrella them into what we call a specific learning disability or specific learning disorder. Okay? We used to call them dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, but now, although we still call it that, we do group them. So anything to do with learning is to do with academia. Okay? Anything to do with intellectual disabilities is to do with IQ and adaptive behaviour. And I'll talk a lot more about that in a minute. So mental retardation is now called intellectual disabilities, and this is about IQ and adaptive behaviour. And this will all become apparent as we go on. We're also going to talk in this class about physical disabilities. Although this is online, I am going to touch on it a little bit today. The most popular being muscular dystrophy, cerebral palsy, spina bifida, and hydrocephalus. And because they're the most popular, those are the ones we're going to talk about. And then, of course, you get hearing disabilities and visual disabilities as well. So we're going to cover in this course all of these. Unfortunately, UDLN lot have got gifted and talented this semester as well. So usually I would do a talk on twice as exceptional children. But because you are doing the same course, this Tuesday and on Friday, I'm not going to do it twice. I'm only going to do it once, and I will do that on Friday the 25th of October. If any of you are interested who are not DLN, you can come along. It will be in here on a Friday night. Otherwise, I will record it, I will upload it to Blackboard, and you can watch it in your own time. But it's just for your general knowledge. It will not be included in the MCQ. Okay? So just to give you more information. I will go on to explain what twice as exceptional means in a minute. Okay, let's kick off with intellectual disabilities. The most common syndromes associated with intellectual disabilities are Down syndrome, Fragile X syndrome, and amazingly, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Now, some of you might not have even heard of that. Now, we know Down syndrome is genetic. We know Fragile X is genetic. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is because mothers drink alcohol during pregnancy. And it is a massive problem in the United States of America, in Europe. Not so much here, but certainly within the US. And of course, those mothers who drink during pregnancy are more likely to be of lower socioeconomic status, may not necessarily be in a stable relationship, and these children often go up for adoption, which brings a whole new realm of problems that they are facing. Yeah? So it's an environmental issue as well. So an intellectual disability, we're talking about a generalised neurodevelopmental disability. There's not just one factor that will create an intellectual disability. You have to have a low IQ, and by low IQ I mean less than 70. We think about the average IQ of being about 100. to have an intellectual disability, you need to have an IQ less than 70. Now the DSM-5 has changed, and it's not just about IQ. We also look at adaptive functioning. And by this, we mean how do they perform in the real world? Their daily living skills, their communication, their motor skills. Okay? So it's about how they interact and how they can get on in the world as well. So we have genetic factors. Fragile X, we know, is one gene. PKU, fetal ketonuria, I can never say that right. It is a protein that builds up in the brain and causes horrific issues if it is not caught early enough. It is a recessive gene, so you can be a carrier, but if you have those double recessive alleles, you are prone to having PKU. Down syndrome, you get that extra 21st chromosome. Okay, you get the extra. All of those will lead to low IQ and adaptive functioning problems. We also have prenatal illness and issues. Fetal alcohol syndrome, maternal infections, illnesses, and also birth defects as well. Now, we know that if mothers have rubella, it can lead to children having intellectual disabilities. If they have measles, there are lots of illnesses that can lead, meningitis can lead to children having and being born with intellectual disabilities. Encephalitis, inadequate treatment of some childhood illnesses can lead to brain deficits and issues with the developmental pathways within the brain. We also know that the environment can cause intellectual disabilities. There was a lot of research done in Romania, in the orphanages, where there is no, have you heard of attachment theory in your undergrad? If you don't form a secure attachment to an adult, you are likely to have issues with relationships, with brain development if there is neglect. Okay? This can lead to an intellectual disability. Malnutrition and abuse. Now, with research in the current climate, we know that 70% of intellectual disabilities is genetic. There are mutations, there are particular genes. And as we develop our understanding of these genetic contributions, we can tease apart what environmental factors cause and lead to individuals having intellectual disabilities. And hopefully you guys might go into some research and find out what environmental factors do cause these intellectual disabilities, what genetic factors, and we can help these individuals. Certainly with things like fetal alcohol syndrome, they do not need, it shouldn't exist. Yeah? Parents, mothers shouldn't drink during pregnancy. This shouldn't happen. Abuse shouldn't happen. Yeah? And it's all about, advertising the awareness of these disorders to stop this happening. They're preventative. Okay, autism. A few of you work with autistic kids, you said. It is a neurodevelopmental disorder characterised by restrictive and repetitive behaviours, social and communication challenges. The genetics are fascinating when it comes to autism. We know that there are about 200 to 900 genes that are involved with autism. We know that there are a lot of mutations. We know that men who have very old sperm and are having babies in their 50s and 60s with younger ladies who have young eggs, the genetics of the old sperm and the young egg will lead to mutations, and this can cause autism. So there is an awful lot going on with the genetics behind autism. We also know that more boys have autism than girls. We also know that actually a lot of neurodevelopmental disabilities are higher in boys than they are in girls. And this is thought to be because girls have a protective factor of oxytocin, chemical. Yeah? So it's fascinating to understand and tease apart. And as the course goes on, we will talk about that a lot more. Anyway, back to autism. Okay, restrictive and repetitive behaviour. Now, how many of you get stressed? How many of you get anxious? And if I asked you again in week 13, you'd be like, oh, Lexi, I am so stressed. I have no fingernails left. I've bitten them all. Yeah, or I've eaten the side of my fingers because I'm anxious. Yeah, especially when you stand up there and do your presentation. Autism, the repetitive behaviours, the hand flapping, yeah, the twirling round and round, the rocking backwards and forwards. We think this is to do with anxiety. Just like we would bite our fingernails, these children perform these repetitive behaviours to reduce that level of anxiety. And when I show you my picture of the brain, if you've heard of the limbic system, which is right in the middle of the brain, our limbic system deals with our emotions. And in children with autism, this amygdala part of the limbic system is smaller. And we think that has something to do with anxiety, eye contact. Children with autism don't like eye contact because it makes them anxious. Okay? So there are lots of brain-based functions that relate to these particular symptoms of autism. Okay, so repetitive behaviours. We also have restrictive behaviours. How many children, people who work with autism, their children love Thomas the Tank Engine, love air conditioning units, could talk to you to death about the history of something. MTR maps, absolutely. Very restrictive behaviours. Yeah, this is part of the diagnosis for autism. Now we know autism now is on a continuum. Yeah, from quite highly functioning to very low functioning. Doesn't mean that highly functioning have fewer symptoms. They still have restricted and repetitive behaviours. They just show them in different ways. You still have restrictive and repetitive behaviours, just the highly functioning will do it in a slightly different way. They will tell you everything there is to know about some scientific something that you have no idea about, but it's still very restricted. It's just far more highly functioning than your low functioning Thomas the Tank Engine lover. Yeah? They're still very focused, but just on different things and in different ways. And we'll come back to that a lot when we talk about autism. Social interaction, we've talked about the limbic system, that amygdala, they don't know how to form relationships. Socially inept. They have a pure disregard for other individuals. And when I show you my wonderful map, you will know that this is in your parietal lobe. Should I hand these out? Now, don't judge me. I was told at 16 never to do art. So I have tried. You probably won't even read my handwriting, but I will work you through it, okay? And I'll try and draw at the end on the board to give you a better idea of what I'm talking about. So let's hand these out. And this is why there is no textbook on this course, because it is so new and so exciting. Now I've only got 20. How many of you here? I might have to copy some more. So the parietal lobe deals with all our sensory information. It's how we process touch and feel. And we all know that autistic kids don't like to be hugged, they don't like to be touched. If there's a label in the back of their jacket, it has to be taken off. I still have to cut labels out of my 11-year-old's pants because he just won't wear them. Yeah? Oh. Is there enough? You might have to share for now, and I will print some more off later. This part here. I was told there was only going to be 23 of you. There's a lot more than 20. Just share for now. You're not actually missing out on much, I promise you. It is on the PowerPoint, and I will draw it at the back. So your parietal lobe is about sensory information, okay? And it's blocked. These children do not process that sensory information. And when we talk about sensory process integration disorder, we know that children with ADHD do not have this, but children with autism do. They have a sensory processing disorder, and that is the parietal lobe in their head. We know that they have, going back to behaviours, repetitive behaviours. This can be verbal. It can be echolalia, very robot type of voice. Okay, so this can be verbal, and it can be very rigid in their language. And of course, social and communication, not just verbal communication. We know a lot of children who have autism, who are low functioning, don't have any verbal communication at all. They also, the social goes with the communication because of non-verbal communication. You and I will pick up cues. Those children don't. If I'm looking at my 14-year-old daughter and we're at the dinner table and she's chatting away or using a phone and I give her a stare, she will understand what I'm talking about. These children who have autism don't. Okay, they don't pick up on those social cues. So that's why social and communication go together, and restricted and repetitive behaviours go together. And we will do 2 lectures on that because it's so exciting. Okay, 2E children. We are not doing this, but I'm going to go through it because it is really interesting. I will do that lecture on the 25th of October. You can come to it if you like, just let me know so I know I've got enough chairs. It is about children who are twice as exceptional. These children have a gift. They have an IQ of above 114, 117. They also have maybe a specific learning disorder. They may be dyslexic. These children have a very high IQ, but they might have ADHD. Okay? And boy, are children who have 2E and ADHD amazing. Those children are the ones who are going to find all sorts of cures for cancer and things like that because their brain is constantly working. They are not just impulsive, but they are also incredibly bright, and they don't sit still, and they are doing a million things at once. These children are, if you've ever met one, they are just fabulous to work with. So these are the children who have autism spectrum disorder, but can make the most amazing Lego creations. They are going to be the engineers, the architects of the future. Just because they have autism doesn't mean to say they won't do something amazing. These children can have high functioning, what we used to call Asperger's, and I do fall back into that, high functioning autism, but, you know, can tell you more about the history of presidential elections than anything else. How many of your university professors do you think have high functioning autism? Social skills, they do not have. An understanding of a very specific thing, yes, okay? These are your engineers, these are your university professors. And dyslexic children, they can't read a recipe, they can't write, but they can come up with some amazing, delicious creations. They might have dyslexia, but they are 2E, they are exceptional children. So that is a wonderful lecture that we will miss out on, unfortunately. Okay, I'm going to talk for another 5 minutes and then we'll have a break. Otherwise I lose my voice. Specific learning disorders, we now have an umbrella for dyslexia, dyscalculia and dysgraphia. 3 ridiculously silly words for dyslexia, dyscalculia and dysgraphia. Now another one of my amazing drawings. It is all about processing, understanding and using language. Now some of you might have a little brain in front of you. We know that on the left hand side of our brain we process language. Okay, only on the left hand side of our brain. And there are 2 particular regions of our brain. In the temporal lobe is called the Wernicke's area, and that is to do with understanding language. And we know in dyslexia that is an issue of that particular part. And also production of language in Broca's area, okay, which is in the prefrontal cortex. And of course the visual system in dyslexia. If you can't read, you're not processing the information to your occipital lobe at the back of your head, okay? And you're not then transferring that onto your language areas of your brain. So dyslexia is a problem with understanding and using language in particular parts of the brain. It is all now under an umbrella. Can you see? You have to look over here. Dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, they are not visual impairments. They are not hearing impairments. It is not autism, and it is not an intellectual disability. It is not an emotional issue. It is not because of pure bad teaching. It is a brain-based disorder. Okay, it's not environmental. Just because you didn't get to learn to read until you were 7 does not lead to dyslexia. It might impact your reading, but dyslexia, dyscalculia, it's all to do with our brains. And we'll talk a lot about working memory. Now, have all of you done an undergrad in psych? Most of you done an undergrad in psych. Okay. I'm going to go through a few things with you as well next week and the week after, just to recap, because it might have been some time before you've done these things. When we talk about working memory, we're talking about being able, and we'll talk a lot about this next week when we talk about ADHD. We're talking about being able to hook things. Now, some of you will have a brilliant working memory. Mine is awful. And as we age, it gets worse. Working memory is all about being able to kind of hook something that you see, that you hear, being able to bring it together and process it. Okay? What you see, what you hear, bring it together and process it. So if I said to you a few numbers and you were doing a maths problem, children who have dyscalculia can't hold those numbers in their head whilst they try and do something else. That is working memory, holding something and trying to process it. These children have real difficulties with that kind of working memory. And also visually, they might be able to read the words, but they're not holding that information, understanding it and processing it. They're literally just reading the words. Okay, so it is a real deficit in working memory, and we'll talk a lot about that next week when we talk about ADHD, because boy have they got a lot of problems with their working memory and executive functioning. So it's all about understanding and processing language, auditory and visual information, particularly with dyslexia, processing reading, making it go to our occipital, our understanding, and then, reflecting that back onto the different areas of the brain. And of course, this leads to real social, emotional, and confidence issues. Now, one of my very good friends told me a couple of months ago that her daughter had been diagnosed with dyslexia. She cried for a month. Okay? Having, and we'll talk about this in a minute, labeling children, and knowing that your child is going to be different causes a lot of issues for parents as well as for children, because we're talking about self-confidence and the ability to go to school and learn. This has a major impact on everyday functioning. Okay, we're going to talk about ADHD and then a few more, and then I promise we'll have a break. Okay, ADHD. This is the one I'm most passionate about. I love ADHD. From a brain point of view, it is fascinating. It is the most common of all neurodevelopmental disabilities, and I think it's safe to say it is the least understood. Particularly, I mean, you guys are going into applied psychology. You know more than everybody else, okay? And hopefully today you'll know even more, and after the lecture next week you're going to be experts, okay? ADHD, it is a disorder of self-regulation. It is a disorder of executive functioning, and we'll talk about executive functioning next week. But if you can remember a disorder of self-regulation, these children do not stop and think. Yeah? They take risks, and boy do they take a lot of them. And if you want to know the biggest predictor of teenage pregnancy, adolescent girls who have ADHD. Okay, one of the biggest predictors of teenage pregnancy. It's a disorder of self-regulation, and that is a disorder of working memory. They don't have that voice inside their head. I'll talk about that next week, otherwise we'll talk about this too much. Okay, the presentation in the DSM-5 is going to change for the next revision. At the moment, you can have a combined diagnosis, inattentiveness, hyperactivity and impulsivity. You might just have inattentiveness, and that is going to change because that is sluggish cognitive tempo, and that's something we don't go into, but that inattentiveness is really not part of ADHD in the new understanding of the results of research that is going on at the moment. You can have hyperactivity and impulsivity together, and that is actually quite common. When we get to teenage years and through on to adulthood, that hyperactivity disappears and goes internal. Adults with ADHD are the ones who aren't running around the classroom. They are the ones who are doing 7 different projects, who have 3 different reading books on the go, who are meeting somebody for coffee yet going to the supermarket and have 7 different work projects on the go. They internalise it and they are just constantly busy. Hyperactivity of running around the room and being quite excited is actually a symptom of anxiety. Okay, so you know you have to understand the symptoms in order to understand the disorders. This has a major impact on school, on home, on relationships, and also on themselves with low self-esteem. Okay, it has a major impact on everything. Now we know that ADHD is predominantly genetic, and boy does that cause even more problems, because they are 50% likely that their parents have ADHD as well. And that mum was probably very young when they had the child in the first place. Yeah, so it's a cycle, and it's a fascinating area to go into. So it's a disorder of self-regulation, of emotion, and that pretty much sums up ADHD, and we'll go into that in a lot more detail next week. Okay, visual and hearing, we know that these are to do with the critical period in vitro. When you're pregnant, there is a critical period where everything has to be correct in order for your vision to develop properly and for your hearing to develop properly. Lots of preterm babies who are born too early have hearing issues. We know this because a lot of issues with rubella, if mums have rubella during pregnancy, we know it can be genetic, toxoplasmosis, herpes, can all influence the development of our hearing. Okay, And again, with visual impairment, it can be trauma, but it can also be a macular degeneration as we get older as well. There are lots of different things that can influence the child when they are developing, and we call that the critical periods and sensitive periods, when things have to be exactly right when you're pregnant in order for certain things to develop. And these can be damaged by a lot of external issues. I've said about those, we're going to go into those in slightly more detail. Now, unfortunately, we don't have time for a lecture on this, but it is all online. Cerebral palsy is about movement issues. It is muscular tone and motor skills. Half of individuals who have cerebral palsy, so 1 in 2 will have an intellectual disability as well. A lot of them will have epilepsy, so there is an awful lot going on with children who have cerebral palsy. It's usually caused by brain damage, and we're talking about issues during birth. We're talking about physical harm to the head, which influences the brain. There are also 1 in 4 are genetic. Okay, so there's a lot going on with cerebral palsy. Now, spina bifida and hydrocephalus. Spina bifida is where the spinal cord doesn't develop normally during pregnancy, and we know that simply taking folic acid now stops a lot of spina bifida, and it is now added to an awful lot of cereals and breads. Now, when your spinal cord develops, it's like a glasses case, and when you're inside your mother's stomach during pregnancy, the spinal cord kind of gets wrapped and enclosed, and depending on where that gets stuck, if it gets stuck here on your sort of T11, you're going to have a lot of problems with spina bifida because your spinal cord is, flopping around. You will have quadriplegic issues, you won't be able to use your arms and your legs, you'll have problems feeding, you'll have problems with your bowels, and if it gets stuck there, you don't have a very long life expectancy. As it goes down, as development progresses, and we are really talking about the first 3 weeks of life, parents don't even know mums don't even know they're pregnant. If we get down to sort of the T1 area, down to our backs here, people with spina bifida can live a pretty decent life. They might be able to walk, they might just have a few issues with bowel control, but it is certainly preventable. 80% to 90% of individuals with spina bifida also have hydrocephalus. Hydrocephalus is water, well, they call it water on the brain, but actually it's spinal fluid. And of course, if this isn't zipped up, all that spinal fluid is going into the brain. And if it's not caught early enough, these children die. So there are some amazing advances in medicine now, where even babies before they are born can be operated on in vitro to close up that hole, and that really does prevent this hydrocephalus as well. Hydrocephalus can be operated on, and they put a stent in, and this just reduces the amount of fluid that is accumulating on the brain. Okay, lastly, muscular dystrophy. It is genetic, it affects males. There are 2 different types, and it can be quite profound. There's nothing we can do about it, but there is a lot of occupational therapy that we can use to help these children. Lastly, sensory processing disorder. Is it a disorder? We will find out. Some people believe it is. Some people think there's not enough research done on it, so we can't decide. Okay. A lot of children who have autism have sensory processing issues, we know that, but is it a disorder in its own right? We'll find out on one of our last teaching weeks. Okay, okay, labels. How many of you work in schools? Yeah, quite a few of you. Labels, do we think they're useful or controversial? Now, when we talk to clinicians and you guys, you'll probably actually, the vast majority of you would go, actually, they're pretty good. Someone can come into my clinic and they can tell me that they've got autism or that their child has autism. And I'll go, okay, that means you've got restrictive, repetitive behaviours and you've got a social communication issue. I know where I'm starting from. They can come in and say they've got a specific learning disability. And I go, okay, I know you've got dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia. I know the starting blocks. It is a shorthand for communication between clinicians. And when you leave here today, or by the end of this course, you're going, okay, I'm a clinician. I know what I'm talking about. These are the symptoms. Talk to me as you were a clinician. That's brilliant. If you're a parent, it might be a whole different ballgame. You're labelling that child. You might not be able to change. You might be stigmatised. Yeah? You label somebody with ADHD and that's it. That kid's got ADHD. And they live up to that expectation. So there are some real pros and cons of labelling children. And also sort of the meaning of labels changes and the controversy of labels. We talked about terminology earlier. I'm sure in whatever language that you speak, you can think of some really derogatory words to call your friends that have been stigmatised with mental illness in the past, the label we give to people. In English, we would call somebody a spastic. We call somebody crazy, yeah, retarded. All those words now have been stigmatised with that mental health. And you're only calling your friend stupid. Yeah, there's a real stigmatism to it. So these labels change over time. And I wouldn't be surprised in the next couple of revisions of the DSM, we're actually calling them children with differences. Yeah, we're not calling them disabilities or disorders, they're just differences. So again, the terminology changes, the labels change. But they don't always have to be harmful. They can actually be a label of forgiveness, a label of understanding. Your child with ADHD. Okay, I understand it. You've got no working memory. Your prefrontal cortex is just not developed. I understand why you shouldn't be allowed to drive the car. That risk-taking behaviour. So sometimes it can give us an understanding. For parents, it can actually bring them together. Give them a group identity. Parents who have a diagnosis of an intellectual disability for their child or autism, some of those feelings are like the death of a spouse. You're grieving for the child you never had. The only other people who understand that are other parents who are going through the same thing. So sometimes actually a label can bring people together. And also, if you've got private medical care, you get funding. You get funding for a support teacher. Yeah? The schools get funding because you've got that disability. So sometimes labels are good, sometimes they're not so good. Labels can help you get the right educational support. And actually they bring people together. If you've got a diagnosis of a language disorder, you could have an educational psychologist on your team, you could have a speech therapist on your team, and people working together. So I'm going to get you lot to talk to each other now. Say hello to the person behind you and in front of you, get to know each other. What do you think? What experiences have you had? Have you been labelled yourself? Do you know somebody else who's had a label? As I said, my friend whose child got the diagnosis of a specific learning disability, she cried for a month. Yeah? Why do we have these feelings associated with labels? So talk to your next door neighbour and let's see what you think as a general consensus in the end. What do you reckon? We label or not label? The pros, the cons, for and against. just write a little list now in groups. Just 5 minutes, give you time to talk. Okay, I'll give you just 2 more minutes.
其實佢學到嘢，點解咧？因為我啲老師嘅時候，好多老師咧，其實冇講嗰個即係教書之餘，我其實3年佢就係基本都係咧，就會落學政府嘅分配，而政府分配咧就會安排咗一啲即係好似投資者嘅資料去幫佢睇住個學生。其實係要從可能老師教書嘅書去傳呢個係事。咁跟住之後就當然因為人嘅世界一定唔想歧視嘅情況下，全世界都有一個自治同埋一個明顯嘅分別，學生嘅小朋友好似温書去中意，因為學書收得唔好嗰陣時間，有類似。但係你話好處，我想講嗰個集嘅究竟嗰個自治會幫到佢咧，就反而因為如果全部都係正係成交好多嘅因素。
So what's the general idea? Has anybody had any particular positive experiences with labels? Anybody had any positive experience? Yeah? Anybody else? Positive experiences? Negative experiences? Anybody been bullied or know people who've been bullied? So what do we think? The general consensus in the room. As a parent, put yourself in a parent perspective. Do you think a label would be good or bad? Yeah, it can. Yeah, it can be quite positive.
I think it's really controversial.
Yeah.
Because there are news about an autistic children in the train. Then he's autistic, so he can't control. He was flapping. Then by mistake, he somehow had a middle-aged man who was very grumpy. Then the middle-aged man didn't know that he was autistic and he bit him. It was really bad. Then the mom was really angry. And then it went on news, like big news, like a year ago. And then on the newspaper, it was really emphasizing that the children was autistic. And then I don't know. I just sort of felt like if you were labeled, you would be treated differently. It could be bad. It could be good. But as a parent, I don't think I would want my children to be labeled.
It's difficult. There are very much positive aspects of having a label. You get that diagnosis, you get the understanding, you get the help, you get the specialism. You also get the stigma of having autism or whatever your label is. And the understanding. People just do not understand what it is. I mean, how many people do you see with Down syndrome walking around? Sometimes people don't want to sit next to them. They don't understand it. They think they can catch it. Yeah, they just don't understand. And I think a lot of it is about education. Yeah. Particularly, I'm going to show you some stats later. You know, how many people, not just in Hong Kong but around the world, want to admit that their child has autism, has an intellectual disability. There's a huge stigma attached to mental health, let alone mental disabilities as well. So there is not just one right or wrong answer. As a clinician, labels are brilliant because we get the symptoms, we get the money, we get the funding, awesome. But as a parent, it's a whole different kettle of fish. Okay?
So yeah, it's a definite love-hate relationship to that. Okay, now I've talked a bit about the causes when I talked about the disorders, but I'm just going to run through a little bit again. And of course, we will look at this each week when we look at the etiology, the causes of these disorders. But just to recap, a lot of neurodevelopment is genetic. It might not just be one gene, but it might be a mutation of genes. We know that Down syndrome is genetic when it comes to intellectual disability. We know about Fragile X, again, one single gene, but it could be multiple genes. We know that muscular dystrophy is one gene. We know that ADHD is lots of different genes. We know in girls particularly, every single girl who has ADHD is because of a genetic predisposition. With boys, it's about 70%. The rest is acquired. We know that there is a genetic environmental interaction. If you have a genetic predisposition to ADHD and your mum smokes or drinks during pregnancy, that can make your ADHD worse. So it's not as clear-cut as it might seem. We know that dyslexia runs in families. We know that ASD runs in families. And of course, as clinicians, and that mum walks in, that dad walks into your clinic and or school, and you're the teacher or your shadow teacher or you're working with these individuals, you're not only dealing with the child who has a genetic condition, you're also dealing with the parents as well. Okay? And sometimes trying to explain the cause of ADHD and autism to somebody who's also on the spectrum as well can cause issues. We know that drugs have, like particularly alcohol. We know that there are certain smoking, measles. We know that whooping cough. We know that meningitis. We know that rubella. A lot of different drugs and diseases can influence our brain development. We know that injury, being shaken, being hit on the head, simply just putting a helmet on your child when they're on a skateboard, when they're on a bicycle, can prevent injuries of intellectual disabilities. We know that asphyxia, lack of oxygen at birth, is a huge one for creating brain-based disorders, particularly with cerebral palsy. A lot of children with cerebral palsy have it because of problems during birthing. Autism as well is linked to lack of oxygen at birth. Visual impairment, hearing impairment as well. So, you know, how these children are born has a massive impact on brain development. We'll go into those within the weeks. Now, prevention and early identification within Hong Kong. Actually, prevention is pretty good here. You have a very good public awareness and health education. You actually have quite a good screening service and early detection of a lot of different disabilities. You get the heel prick test for PKU. Different insurance companies will pay for different things, but a lot of the hospitals now will do a lot of the immunisation programs, and you immunise against a lot. And we know throughout the world that the more we immunise our children, the fewer cases of measles, mumps, rubella, whooping cough, and everything else that goes with it. And we know for sure, there is absolutely no debate at all, immunisations do not cause autism. Okay? If there's one thing you didn't know before, take that today. Immunisations do not cause autism. And I'll show you research on that when we talk about autism. So since 2008, so actually quite recently in the grand scheme of things, the EDB have started an early identification system, particularly for specific learning disabilities, language and speech disorders. They are referred to different assessment centres here within Hong Kong, and they are dealing with treatments and therapies and follow-ups. There are a lot of private clinics as well. There's Spot, if anybody heard of Spot? No? And there's a few others within Hong Kong. There are special schools as well but there are also some private schools. So there is a lot that is going on with identification within Hong Kong. When we're looking at disabilities, the biggest we can see is physical disabilities. This is a census in 2013. It's probably changed, but it will still be within the same-ish percentages. We then have restriction in body movement, mental disabilities, and we pop up here, visual, hearing, and then always at the bottom you've got your speech, your autism, and your specific learning disabilities and your ADHD. So what we are talking about are kind of within the minority, the smallest of the disabilities and types of disabilities. But it gives you an idea of the percentage of distribution within Hong Kong. So education, now we pick up this a lot on the gifted and talented, but since 1995, there really has been a strive towards equal opportunities and to give every child the potential to be the person that they can be. Okay, and this is sort of the objective being that people with disabilities develop physically, they develop mentally, and they have the social capacity to be the person that they can, to strive towards equal opportunities and move away from discrimination and harassment. So one way they have done this, and this isn't just Hong Kong, this is around the world, we have looked at inclusive education. Education for all. Doesn't matter if you're autistic, you've got ADHD, you will be within a mainstream school. Now, this is generally accepted around the world. It's certainly the case in the States, it's certainly the case in the UK, within Europe. Here is slightly different. You have your tier system, your tier 1 schools, your tier 2 schools, your tier 3 schools. And we'll come on to that now. Stress in teaching is huge. The workload is massive. If you've then got to deal with a child in your class of 30 odd children with no help, it's a very difficult situation to be in. Now, funding in Hong Kong usually goes to, is it band 3? Okay, the schools? I always get my banding the wrong way. Band 1 and band 2 generally might see children who have high functioning Asperger's, but they don't get to deal with the behavioural problems. The funding usually goes to those band 3 schools and not necessarily to those children who actually need it. Yeah. So there is a little bit of controversial ideas about where that funding goes and how these teachers can cope. Primary schools are dealing more and more with an array of difficulties within the classroom, and it is getting more and more problematic, isn't it? Yeah, lots of people are nodding. Yeah, you're dealing with symptoms and syndromes, you're on your own, and it is very difficult. And throughout this course we will give you as much information on how to deal in the classroom with your autistic or your ADHD or your specific learning disabilities child. Not only does the curriculum change, but trying to differentiate the learning is very difficult. So for those of you who are interested, there's a lovely paper here about improving teachers' self-efficacy, and by that we mean the belief in your own ability to apply teaching and learning strategies and classroom management to children with special educational needs within Hong Kong. So if that is something you are interested in, it's a very interesting paper to read for those of you who are going into the EdPsych or the shadow teacher or TLAs. Right, what I want to do is get into groups and have a think about arguments. Why should we include all children in mainstream schools? What can a child who has a neurodevelopmental disorder get out of being in a classroom full of neurotypical children? Have a think. What about the argument for educating SEN kids in special schools? What do they get out of being with other children who are the same as them?
So why were you considered as special?
the Hong Kong approach to educating SEN children is mainstream. So what do you think that does? Is it working? Why? And if you don't want to do it on Hong Kong, do it on wherever else you want to do it on. Okay? If you're not educated here or not from here. So it's up to you what you do. But I want you to think about, why should we educate children in SEN schools, in mainstream schools and in SEN schools? What are the arguments for and against? So have a little think about that. Turn to your neighbour and see what we can come up with.
Learning, but actually he cannot read 26 pages. Also sad for the whole year.
And how does that make him feel? Think of his social development, his emotional development, his depression, the self-esteem that goes with that. Maybe he should be with others in a special school. What about children who are hard of hearing? Yeah, the resources. For the first time ever, I have got a visually impaired undergraduate. For me, I'm like, oh man, it's a lot more work. Yeah.
As in, you can't see?
Can't see at all. In a massive undergraduate lecture theatre with 200 students. Brilliant. But yeah, I mean, how they're going to cope and how we change things is interesting. You know, we don't have Braille on a big scale. So, you know, there are a lot of arguments for and against, and I think it just comes down to that individual child, and unfortunately it comes down to the money. Those who can afford a shadow teacher or a one-on-one teacher, or can afford iPoise school or things like that, they can get the specialist attention, and sometimes you just can't. The insurance companies don't pay for it. So there are some wonderful arguments for and against. And Hong Kong approach to education is just try and be as inclusive as it possibly can, but they do have special schools for hearing impairment, for visual impairment. They have children's schools for intellectual disabilities as well as a few for autism. And particularly when you talk about autism, you know, the methods and the treatments can be very intensive. And sometimes if you want that approach for your child, it needs to be almost 24/7, doesn't it, with the ABA therapy. So teacher stress comes down to labels, comes down to the diagnosis that individual has, and also learning from others. Okay, we're going to change tack slightly, and we're going to talk about classifications of disorders for the last half an hour, 45 minutes or so. Now, there are two main systems for classifying disorders and mental health issues, and we call these the ICD and the DSM. Now, the ICD is the International Classification of Diseases, and that is now on its 11th edition. The DSM-5 is obviously on its 5th edition. They both do exactly the same things. The ICD has and does cover a lot more diseases and health-related issues. Now, here at PolyU, within the psychology department, we do tend to use the DSM, and when I was teaching in the UK, we actually use the DSM as well. And I think for mental health issues, we do tend to use the DSM more than we do the ICD. But generally, it depends what you fancy. Depends sometimes on who will buy you the manual yeah, on how you classify. Within Hong Kong, you tend to use a combination of anything and everything like you would anywhere else in the world. It just comes down to either personal preference or funding. Now, there is a video I wanted to show, and I'll see if that works. It might not. I don't know why you're not working. It's Apple TV, I think. I'll come back to that at the end. So the DSM is actually a really important book. It really came about because we needed to standardise what we were talking about. And in psychology, if you remember right back to your first undergraduate days, we talk about definitions, and we talk about understanding that if you're telling me you're unhappy, I understand what that means with depression. We're all singing off the same song sheet. It comes down to validity. You're measuring what you want to measure, that you're supposed to measure, and it comes down to reliability, that each time that you measure it, you're going to be measuring the same thing. So if I'm looking at stress in poly-U students, I want to know that what I'm measuring in the clinical symptoms are on stress and not on depression. So there's a lot of statistics, a lot of research that goes into the classification systems. Now, when we're talking about disorders, what makes something a disorder? How does somebody suddenly have autism or dyslexia? How does somebody go from being typically developing to having the symptoms of a disorder? How do we classify that?
When you take like about 8 out of 10 boxes, something like that?
Pretty much. We can do it statistically, so that we can say you are in the top 5% of the population and therefore you have depression. On that clinical cutoff, you score too high over there, and it is generally, we call that the 5% rule. You have to be in that 5%. But usually a disorder begins with impairment, and that impairment is to do with clinical symptoms, and that interferes with your daily life. When symptoms become problematic, you can't do what a normal, typically developing child or person would do. And a lot of that is to do with self-injury, so you're injuring and you're hurting yourself or other people as well. And that is generally the idea of what something becomes a disorder, when you are not being able to cope with everyday life. So it could be having panic attacks. It could be restricted and repetitive behaviours. Okay, so it's interfering with your daily life. And we just all needed to sing from the same song sheet. Now, within the DSM-5, and I'm going to get you to think about this and to talk about this, do we think of things as clinical cut-offs, or do we think of things along a continuum? It's a very interesting debate. Okay, within the DSM, because it's all about statistics and it's all about funding and money and insurance companies, and it's medicine, you either have a disorder or you don't. You are depressed or you're not. You have ADHD or you're not. But interestingly, with the last revision of the DSM-5, we've put autism now on a continuum, from quite highly functioning to not. And I think there are changes that are going to be made within that, but we'll just have to wait and see. Very interesting. We'll look about this. I've done a video for you. Now again, my technology is very minimal, but I've done it as a video so you can listen to it again and you can go back and you can understand it, because quite frankly, understanding the history of the DSM is rather boring, so I've done it quite simply. But what I want you to think about is, why do we need it? And there are two reasons why we need it. Why has the Organisation of Mental Health Classification System differed? Why do we have the ICD? Why do we have the DSM? Why do we have different things over time? Think about how many disorders were included in the first DSM, which was published way back in 1952, even before I was born, I'd just like to say. And what were they called? Because they weren't actually called disorders. So we've come a long way. Who was the main guy that was really interested in understanding disorders to do with reliability? Yeah? If I was looking at a symptom and you were looking at a symptom, are we reliable? Yeah. And that came in the DSM-3, so that was very late on. What was the main reason the DSM-5 changed, and what did it hope to do? Why did we need the DSM-5? And lastly, as a group, I'd like you to think about whether you think disorders are in categories or whether they are on continuums. I'm going to show you this video. I might have to just... Oh, it might work. Oh, it's this. Hold on. I've lost my mouse now. Yeah, there it is. This is just a brief overview of the history of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Now, this is a very important book, and it deals with standardising of all the mental health disorders, so we can deal with them in the same way, regardless if you're a medic, a psychologist, or even a psychiatrist. And this came about because we all needed to speak the same language. We all needed a uniformity of diagnosis. And there was also a growing need to collect statistical information on all the different mental health disorders. So the need for classification has been clear throughout the history of medicine, and also the need for agreement of what should actually be included within these classification systems. Over time, the optimal method for organising these classification systems have differed in their emphasis, their etiology, their cause and their defining features, meaning that there have been numerous ideas and great differences in ideas of, for example, where these mental health issues came from in the first place and also what they looked like. Now, some classification systems have included hundreds and others thousands of disorders. And these differences have come from clinical settings, different types of research or admin settings, and this posed a huge problem for clinicians who need to communicate to each other what they are actually seeing. So we begin with getting statistical information and evidence on types and numbers of disorders. And this happened within the DSM-1, which was first published in 1952. And it started to create a consensus across the fields for diagnostic language. It featured a description of 106 disorders, which at the time were all called reactions. These descriptions were simple, just based on a paragraph of ideas and based on the psychodynamic approach, which means the descriptions were based on feelings and emotions related to early experiences. There's a very good link here at the bottom if you want to go to the website where you can see the DSM-1 in its entirety. In 1968, the DSM-2 was published, and this consisted of 134 pages with 182 diagnoses. It eliminated the term reactions and referred to diagnoses instead. Now, the DSM-2 also saw the removal of homosexuality as a mental disorder, and this happened in the late 1970s due to a political shift. The DSM-3 was introduced in the 1980s, and this increased to 265 disorders. And we saw a shift, a major shift away from this psychodynamic approach towards a more empirical research base. So new disorders were added because of the latest research that had been identified in understanding mental health disorders. And this expanded the DSM-3 to 494 pages, which was almost 4 times the size of the DSM-2.
And during this time of the 60s, 70s and 80s, there was quite a lot of political unrest and the idea of problems with reliability towards psychiatric diagnosis. And also public perception of mental health and diagnosis was shaky. Kraepelin, who you can see here in the picture, was a major contributor to this field at this time and was a bit influenced with regard to his belief of mental health being biological and also a genetic problem. So he brought the idea of reliability of diagnosis to light. And so from here on in, the DSM's goal really was to reduce the reliability of diagnosis across all settings. And because of this, the DSM-3 became a worldwide hit and made the APA an awful lot of money. The DSM-3 was revised in 1987, but actually there were very few changes made at this time. The new revision got rid of the hierarchical exclusion rule and brought in the idea that you could have more than one diagnosis at the same time, brought in the idea of comorbidity of diagnosis. The DSM-4 expanded again with 365 disorders, and in order to have disorder included, you need to have far more basis on this empirical research. So again, the idea that your research had to be based on empirical data, clinical studies. So the DSM-5 was revised again in 2013 after 10 years in the making, and this now includes over 400 disorders. There are a few new disorders added: hoarding, binge eating, disruptive mood, and premenstrual dysphoric disorder, all based on empirical data. Yeah, so you've got to have an awful lot of statistics and research, clinical trials, clinical studies, control groups in order to get your disorder into the DSM-5. Now we've stopped totally. The DSM-5 saw a change in our approach to psychopathology and the understanding, be that a categorical approach or a dimensional approach, a continuum approach to understanding mental health issues. So the categorical approach is presumed to be a natural threshold between normal and abnormal. So you either are depressed or you're not depressed. So there's one category for each, and these are distinct and separate, far more based on the medical approach to psychopathology. The dimensional approach, or this continuum, sees that symptoms lay on a continuum ranging from non-existent through to mild, moderate and severe. So looking at a continuum and the depression scale, it can range. It's you're not depressed or not depressed. Okay, so it all looks at how you feel on that particular moment, on that particular day.
It's all got
and
our
advantages and obviously disadvantages to both. The advantages to this sort of categorical approach is it in line with the medical model. You have the flu or you don't have the flu. You have depression or you don't have depression. It really simplifies communication between professionals. You either have ADHD or you don't. And this is really a sort of a natural inclination to use categories. You either have something or you don't have something. And this makes life an awful lot easier when we're looking at insurance companies. And they like the idea of you're sick or you're well. You have something or you don't. It goes back to labelling. It is much easier to find an understanding if we have that clear categorical label. However, there are advantages to the dimensional approach as well. These cut-offs between being depressed and not depressed can be arbitrary. You know, you can feel really good one moment and feel really quite depressed the next. So in a way, it can give us an awful lot more information and a holistic approach to the individual of how many sort of days a week, days a month, days a year are you feeling like this? rather than just sort of a random arbitrary category of you are or you're not. So this tends to be a little bit more reliable, and you're less likely to create this sort of random arbitrary distinction between what is problematic borders of categories, particularly when we look at children with intellectual disabilities and mild, moderate and severe. You know, what are the area, the cusp of the diagnosis categories? Is it better to look at it on a continuum, distinct categories?
Right. That all went a bit funny, and I don't know why, but you have a look at them. So why do we need the DSM? What were the two particular reasons? Anybody want to hazard a guess? Standardization and statistical information. Yeah. Now, standardized just means that we've collected an awful lot of data, and we have that variance. We know what the average is, and we can say that you're above average or below average. So the DSM was all about being able to say to somebody, you are in a clinical cut-off for depression. Yeah, you are above average in these particular symptoms, or you're below average. So it's all about standardizing our understanding of disorders and collecting statistical information. Now, there are some disorders, like sensory processing integration disorder, that just doesn't have enough data yet to be allowed into the DSM-5. You have to have an awful lot of statistics, longitudinal research, which costs money and time and effort in order to get into the DSM-5. So it'll be interesting to see what gets in next. There's a lot of talk about gaming, whether that is an addiction or not. Yeah. So it does change and it does update. Why has the organisation of mental health classification systems differed? I think each profession had a different view of what the main symptoms are, their emphasis, their etiology, their causes. Some of us are psychiatrists, some of us are mental health workers, psychologists, and sort of medics as well. So there's a great differences in the idea of where it comes from, and the DSM kind of organises these classifications into one system. So we're all singing off the same song sheet, we're all doing the same things, we all have the same symptoms. How many disorders were included in the DSM-1? Did anybody pick that one up? Yep, 106, and they were called reactions. And it was very much on our thoughts and our feelings. Freud would be very proud. He has a lot to answer for, you know, not based on any research at all whatsoever, but his controversies has got us talking about it and got us doing research. So his research, you know, was based on adults, even though he did a lot of work with children. And they were all called reactions to things. By the time we got to the DSM-3, we were bringing in far more reliability, consistency over time. So if you were tested in week 1 and in week 5 and in week 10, you would still have the same symptoms. It was reliable from time to time, and it was reliable if I did the test and found those symptoms, and if you did the test, and if you did the test, and if you did the test. So it was test reliability, but also inter-rater reliability as well. We were all doing the same thing, we were all seeing the same symptoms, and that is really important when we are looking at mental health and neurodevelopmental disabilities. They did a lot of changes to make it reliable. Okay, it was all about statistics, it's all about data, it's all about being empirical, and we know that psychologists love a lot of data. Now, the million-dollar question. What do we think? Where do we think this is going? I don't think there is actually one true real answer. You know, do you think that it could be categorical, or do you think it could be continuous? Anybody want to give a reason why, for or against? We can come back to this.
particularly when we talk about intellectual disabilities. We talk about mild, we talk about moderate, we talk about profound. But where are those clinical cut-offs between those categories? Is it better to have it on a continuum? The DSM-5 did put autism on a continuum, so there aren't pervasive developmental disorders not otherwise specified anymore. It is all one. Let's talk about that actually. So the DSM is now huge. If anybody's seen it, you can get it in the library. There's a copy in the reference library. It's 5 instead of V because they're going to start doing 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, etc., etc. And the changes are coming. We now have a lot more data, and I do think it will be revised in the next few years. So when we're talking about neurodevelopmental disabilities, all of these we are covering, apart from motor disorders. Intellectual disabilities changed in the DSM-5. It used to be just about IQ and a cut-off of 70. We are now talking about adaptive functioning, how you manage your home, and of course it is separated into specific categories, okay? And each of these will go down in IQ level. So to be profound, I can't remember off the top of my head, it might be an IQ of less than 40 or something, I can't remember. So we said goodbye to mental retardation, and we said hello to intellectual disabilities. So when you're looking at research and you're reading papers and you're reading articles and books, try and read things, you know, that have come out since the DSM-5, and you'll see it says intellectual disabilities and not mental retardation. Within Hong Kong, they still use it and it irritates me. Okay, communication disorders. Dr. Turnbull is going to come in and talk to you about communication disorders. There were a few changes, and they called them slightly different things, but essentially it is all the same. Language disorders now combines expressive and receptive language, so how we pronounce words and how we understand them, or comprehension. We have speech sound disorder, which is a new name for phonological disorder, and childhood onset fluency disorder. How do they come up with these things instead of stuttering? There was nothing wrong with stuttering, but they've changed it. So you no longer have a stuttering disorder, you have a fluency disorder. Within ASD, they had major changes. This is one of the biggest changes. So ASD now encompasses autism, Asperger's, childhood degenerative disorders, Rett syndrome, which is mainly in girls, pervasive developmental disorders not otherwise specified. And they have done this to make it easier to diagnose it. It is very difficult to see Rett syndrome as Rett syndrome. Okay? The reliability, the validity wasn't there. So they have put them all together, and it makes it much easier as clinicians to say you've got autism. For parents, on the other hand, you want to know what type of autism your child has. Okay? Whether it is highly functioning, whether it is severe. They all have the same symptoms, but the severity is different, and we'll talk about that. Major change to specific learning disorders. Reading, maths, written expression, and again they've done this because of the reliability. Yeah, it's very difficult to just diagnose somebody as having a reading disorder, dyslexia, or to have a dyscalculia, a math disorder. A lot of them have the same problems with working memory and will have more than one. So they won't just have dyslexia, they will have dyslexia and dyscalculia as well. We'll come back onto that later. ADHD, nothing has really changed at all. The onset went from 7 to 12, so you can still be 11 or 12 years old and get a diagnosis of ADHD, remembering that neurodevelopmental disorders are childhood disorders before the age of 18. It is a developmental process.
Now, when we talk about ADHD, we are talking about children on this course, but when we talk about adult ADHD, 50 to 60% of children with ADHD will carry on to have adult ADHD as well, and they have to have 5 symptoms before the age of 17. This is the one category that I think is going to change, and is going to change massively, and we'll talk about that next week. Motor disorders, we are not going to go into this. If you are interested in it and you want a PDF on it, a PowerPoint, use the QR code from your notes, and you can get some more information on it. Right, all good, we've still got sort of 20 minutes or so. This is my wonderful brain. For those of you who don't have it, I will do some more photocopies of it for you next week. Now, over the weeks, you will get an idea of what this all means. It looks a bit daunting at the moment. Don't worry, it's not in your MCQ. I'm not going to ask you to label anything or to know anything. It really is just to understand that these are brain-based disorders, and for you to know whereabouts in the brain this is, okay? And I've had to do this myself because it isn't anywhere else. I've put together a lot of information for you. And I've done another video. This one is a little bit better, I think. We'll do attendance in a minute, hold on. My mouse keeps going different sides. Here we go. Is that going to be loud enough? Okay, it might not be very loud. You might have to look. Okay, so I've just said that there are 2 sides to the brain. Your right hemisphere and your left hemisphere.
Now the left hemisphere is important because it deals with our language.